Welcome to Stay at Home Wellness, where we talk about why wellness is so different for stay at home moms and what to do about it. Today, we're talking about a big part of motherhood, and that is hosting with little kids. And I don't know about you, but before having little kids, you could kind of get away with not planning very well. You could kind of get away with going to the grocery store the same day you're hosting. You could kind of get away with cooking up until the time company came. But I remember getting to this point in motherhood where it just seemed like something would always happen. It didn't matter what it was, but if we were hosting, the fire alarms were going to go off and then all the kids were going to cry. Or I'd find my toddler, I'd be in the fridge and I'd be like, oh, he's fine. He's going to grab something out of the fridge. He's so happy he won't be able to get it open. Next thing I know, he has a condiment bottle. He's smearing ketchup all over the floor. And like, this has actually happened to me before we had like 15 people in our home, right? So things just happen when you have toddlers. And when you combine the fact that you need a lot of buffer time with toddlers and you combine the fact that you have a lot to do, that really spikes the stress level, right? And I've noticed sometimes with hosting, even though I'm doing this because I want to be hospitable, I want to welcome the stranger into our home, I want them to feel like part of the family, sometimes the way I'm treating my kids when I'm stressed out is not a way that I would want somebody else to see, right? Sometimes I'm raising my voice or getting frustrated, even if they're not doing anything wrong. They're just being a little kid and making a mess. A lot of that is amplified when you have a small amount of time. So what I realized as a mom is that I need to change some things. I need to plan ahead a little bit better. And I found some tips that have made hosting not perfect, but a lot less stressful than before. So I want to share those with you. So my first tip is to plan the menu days in advance. And this comes in handy for several reasons. If you plan the menu in advance, you can grocery shop in advance, right? How many of you have run out to the store 3 minutes before company comes, or your husband's like gone and your company are there and you're like, hey, my husband's getting the ingredients I need for the food we're supposed to be eating right now. I don't know. So surely someone out there could relate to that, right? I definitely have been there, and it still happens occasionally where I'm like, oh, I really want to have ice cream with these brownies, and Kirk will run out and grab it. So it's not perfect by any stretch, but the more ingredients like that, like the more essential the ingredient, the more stressful it is if your spouse is at the store getting the ingredient while you're supposed to be cooking the dish. So what I would recommend is if you're having company over that week, in general, I would just recommend meal planning. I can link below to my blog post and podcast all about meal planning. But especially if you're having company, I would highly recommend having a plan of some kind for what to serve the company that are coming. Then you could grocery shop several days in advance with your children. And instead of it being a frantic experience where you're throwing things in the cart and rushing through the grocery store and telling everyone not to cry and just getting stressed out, it could be a much more fun experience where you all look forward to it. You let your little kids help put things in the cart. Just totally changes the dynamic. So highly recommend plan that menu in advance and then grocery shop in advance. My second tip is that I would recommend planning several make ahead options when you're planning that meal. So make ahead options are my new best friend. And I actually discovered these when I worked in food service, and I was working this crazy job where I was like in charge of planning all the menus and doing like all the nutrition coordinator type stuff. But then they also just merged my job with the cook. So at the same time, I was also cooking for 40 to 50 children every day. And in hindsight, that was absolutely crazy. And now when I look at their website, I no longer work there. They have 2 positions, and they have a full-time nutrition coordinator and they have a full-time cook. And I'm like, oh, I was doing 2 positions. No wonder I was stressed out. But I discovered make ahead meal options, which are super awesome. And basically what you could do is you could find foods that you make ahead. So whenever you're planning a menu, you should never plan a meal with little kids that requires you to be cooking all of the dishes seconds before your company arrives or 10 minutes before, right? So you don't want to be roasting your veggies, cooking your pot roast in the oven, baking a loaf of bread. You don't want to be doing everything at once, even if you're using different appliances, like you're using the stove and the oven and chopping up a salad, and you have a cake that's ready to go in once all of that comes out and your company's here. That just adds stress, right? Because how many of you have had a recipe that takes longer than the recipe said, right? Like you're cooking lasagna and you're like, this package said it takes 10 minutes or whatever, 60 minutes for lasagna, but it's taking 70, but then when you multiply that by 3, all of a sudden it's actually like a very stressful occurrence where nothing is ready. Your company's knocking at your door. You're like, And then you can't even be as welcoming to your company, right? Not even talking about your kids, your poor company. They come in and you are stressed out and they're like trying to comfort you, like, it's okay, don't worry. And you're like apologizing all the time. You're stressed. They're trying to comfort you instead of you welcoming them, right? It just totally changes the dynamic. So I would highly recommend make ahead options. Some really great things for this, especially in the wintertime, something like soup and bread. For Sundays, I will make both of those the day before, and then I would cool the soup down oftentimes in the freezer to bring it down to temperature really fast because you don't want to serve compromised food to your company. And I'm a food safety nerd, so I do that. But I will do something like that where I serve soup and bread. You could do taco meat. You can make your salad ahead. Just don't put the dressing on or crunchy toppings. Just keep like all the components separate. But you could chop everything ahead, then just toss it together when your company comes. Makes it so much less stressful. You can make, I do this all the time. You can compile a lasagna the day before. Don't cook it, then just pop it in the oven. So something I love to do when I host lasagna, a meal that includes lasagna, wow, talking today is really hard, guys. When I host a meal that includes lasagna, I make the lasagna the day before. I chop up the salad the day before, just keep the components separate. And then I either make the bread the morning of, or I make that the day before too, if I'm not wanting to stress out. Then all I have to do the day of is have a semi-tidy house and pop the lasagna in the oven an hour before the company comes, right? You can make a dessert ahead too, right? Why make the brownies at 4:45 when your company's coming at 5 and you have dishes in your sink and you're stressed out when you could just make them the day before, right? If you're like me, if you're someone that's super chill, that doesn't care if you're cooking while your company is there, that isn't someone that struggles with getting stressed out at their children or being angry with your children if you're in a hurry, that's fine. Like, enjoy that lifestyle. Enjoy being free and flexible. But if you're like me and that actually causes a lot of stress, then I would highly recommend making as much as you can the day before. It will save you so much time and so much stress, and it will be a much, much better experience. My next tip for hosting with little kids is not to use the same appliance for every single meal. Or for every single component of the meal. So this would mean something like using the stovetop, using a crock pot, and using a couple items you made the day before, right? So instead of saying I need everything in the oven, so I'm going to have to time everything perfectly where I put the roast in at this time and then I take it out to let it sit and then I roast the veggies and then I take those out. It's actually really, really hard to have a meal that is hot if you're relying on the same appliance for every single dish, right? So this may seem obvious to some of you. For me, I learned a lot of this the hard way by feeding 40 children. I do learn a lot of things. But one of the things I learned was if you have something hot that you're serving, you probably want to have some cold things that you prepped the day before, right? Like a salad, a fruit salad. So don't roast veggies if you're using the oven for several things. Rely on a salad that time, right? Or if you have something in the crock pot, then that frees up your oven for something, right? But if you're using a roast, don't try to bake bread at the same time because otherwise you're going to have to stagger it. Staggering it looks great on paper, but when anything goes wrong, it causes a lot of stress, right? So if it looks like on paper, the roast will get out this time and then the bread will take this long, well, how often does that actually happen, right? Or how often does something happen with the kids when you need to put the roast in the oven and then it sets off everything and everything's off track for the whole day, right? You almost have to be like a pessimist when it comes to your meal prep, right? Assume you're going to be interrupted because you will. You have toddlers, you have children. This is the reason for this whole podcast, right? So you will be interrupted. Now that we have this assumption out of the way, now plan your day accordingly. Okay, so that's basically the assumption with all of these tips. You will be interrupted, so don't use the same appliance because then you have to stagger stuff and it makes it really stressful. Don't make it all right before company comes because something will happen. Your child will have a blowout. There will be an accident on the floor, and that's just the way it's going to be. I remember one time this came in really, really handy was when I hosted Valentine's dinner for college students. It was super fun to host, but it's like a fancier meal, right? So I made fettuccine Alfredo and I made the chicken and I made a cheesecake and I made salad and bread and all this stuff. But I think I made all of it the day, like I made the cheesecake. Cheesecakes are a great dessert if you have a big event. Those you can make like three days in advance. I looked it up. It's like quite a bit in advance. So I made that like 3 or 4 days out, and then 2 days out, I made XYZ. Like one day out, I made the fettuccine, like not the noodles, but I made the sauce and the chicken, right? And then you could chop the salad the day before, make your homemade croutons the day before, right? And then the day of, I didn't really have anything to cook except the pasta. I just needed to cook the pasta, and then I just needed to reheat the sauce in the crock pot. And that was awesome. So, and that came in handy because I was also potty training my 2-year-old at the time, and it was not going well. So there was like lots of accidents, lots of big accidents, just like all over the floor, right? So if I had planned to cook all of those things that day, it would have been really easy to get frustrated with my toddler. It would have been really easy to freak out. That company was coming to freak out when random people knocked on my door because they did, wanting to talk. Hey guys, I wanted to jump in and let you know about 2 opportunities that I have for you. So the first one is a free webinar that I've created just for stay-at-home moms who are wanting to learn more about wellness. And the reason is because I truly believe that wellness is totally different if you're a stay-at-home mom because your life is so intertwined with your kids. And so I really don't think that a 20-year-old personal trainer, helpful as they are to so many people, if they don't understand what it's like to be a mom, it is very difficult to give wellness advice to a mom. So I created a whole webinar that dives into why wellness is different as a stay-at-home mom. It goes into how to wake up on time if you are struggling with that and are waking up with your kids and are in that vicious cycle of feeling stressed from the instant you wake up because your children woke you up through the baby monitor. That is not a good place to be, and I've totally been there. This webinar dives into working out postpartum. I know a lot of moms really struggle with overwhelm about where to start postpartum and have just gotten out of the habit totally of working out because they have a new baby, right? And all of their routines are different. How to develop routines when you are used to an employer developing them for you, and now you have to develop them for yourself, which is a huge change. And we even dive into getting things done with kids around. And the reason for this, even though it doesn't directly pertain to wellness, it absolutely affects your wellness routines, because if you cannot get anything done while your kids are awake and you feel like you have to be entertaining them 24/7, then you will not have time to have wellness routines, right? Because when your kids are asleep, you have to clean your whole house from top to bottom and cook all the meals, and you have no time while they're sleeping to work on any routines to take care of your own body, right? So in this webinar, I dive into all of that. I will link it below. The key with the link is click the link and then you wait for the pop-up, and then the pop-up is where you enter your name and your email address, and then it will give you a link that you can copy for the webinar. I think that was a little bit confusing for people last time, so I wanted to make that clear that that's how that works. So wait for the pop-up and then make sure to copy and paste the link, and you will be able to access that webinar, no problem. The second thing I wanted to let you guys know about is that if this episode or other episodes have really resonated with you at all, and you're recognizing that you're a mom that is struggling with wellness, this transition to motherhood has not been easy, and you need a little bit additional support, I would love it if you click the link below to book a call with me. I would love to be able to meet with you and be a habit coach for you, whether that's 1 time or 10 times, and be that support, because I know for me, sometimes I just need someone to talk to, even just for an hour, and to process, like, this is what I'm struggling with, and just problem solve with someone else. I'm a very verbal processor, and sometimes I just need someone to talk about things with and figure out, okay, this is the next step I should take, and then I'm good to go from there. So even if it's 1 time, that's totally fine. But if that interests you at all, I would love it if you went ahead and clicked the link below to book a call with me. Thank you guys so much. If you have those things done, you can enjoy the moments with your kids. You could deal with the multiple accidents. You could deal with the multiple discipline problems, even when you're about to host. And so this is why I would highly encourage you to do some of these tips if you have kids, because it makes your life so much easier, and because it assumes there will be interruptions instead of you constantly being shocked by them all the time. So I would highly recommend that. My last tip, this kind of came from my food service days as well, is to use the crock pot to hot hold food. Hot holding is just keeping food warm. Basically, that's a food service term. It's just keeping food warm till you want to serve it. So this can come in handy, especially if you have a big dinner, or if you're ever hosting like a course dinner, something like that. But it can also come in handy if you just hate pulling things out of the oven right before company gets there. And for me, that just adds a whole level of stress. If I am wondering if the roast will be cooked, I won't know till my company arrive if it's cooked or not, but I want it to be hot, right? So you can actually cook food probably up to an hour ahead. The only thing I would hesitate to do that with is something like pasta or rice. You really don't want that to get mushy. You can cook a lot of foods the day of, but an hour ahead, then just pop it in the crock pot, then use the hour to wash your dishes, play with your kids. A lot of times when I'm hosting after 4 o'clock or whatever, or guests are coming at 5, I could just sit down and read books with my kids on the couch because of all the prep. And I love that. I love that it went from me freaking out and stressing all the time to actually being able to enjoy this time with my kids. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't already, try implementing some of these tips. And I think you will have a much more peaceful hosting routine with little kids. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead, give it a thumbs up, like it. Please share it with your friends. And thank you guys so much for joining me for another episode of Stay at Home Wellness.